I've played the first mystery of the Enchanted RPG with my students, and it went really well. Not perfect, and there were a few surprises, but overall I'm very happy with how the system played out. If you don't know who I am or what the Enchanted RPG is, I'm Will from Enchanted ESL, and I've made the Enchanted RPG, a tabletop role-playing game, specifically for teaching English. You can learn about why I designed it, how it works, how you can run it in your classes, and how you can get to grips with the first mystery in the previous videos in this series. They're all linked in a playlist up there and down in the description. From now on, I'm assuming you're more or less aware of those things. You understand generally how the system runs, and you have an idea of what the Bookshop Blast is, the first mystery. Because now I'm going to tell you how it went with my students, and I'm going to comment on some of the gameplay rules and how they affected the game. So the mystery all begins at school, and here I like to get my students immediately involved in creating the world. They're in the last class of the day, maybe it's double maths or something. They can decide, and then they introduce their characters saying what they're doing in that moment. Maybe some of them are messing around, some of them are sleeping on the table, those kind of things. For students who had played this kind of game before, it was very easy for them to get into this. For new students, it took a bit more prompting, but they got the idea of it pretty quickly. My big takeaway is to try to do things like that as often as possible. Get them to be more immersed in the world and use their language to describe what their characters are doing and how they interact with the other people in the game. Then they finish school and head off home, but they hear an explosion from the middle of town, and naturally all of them headed in that direction to investigate. I mean, that's the whole point of the game. So they found the blown up bookshop and went in to start digging for clues. And this is where things got a little bit messy as we were playing it, because I realised that I hadn't actually followed the rule of giving 3 clues to 1 revelation. So in a mystery, you have a revelation, and then you need multiple clues to direct towards it, because if they miss 1 clue, then if there's no other opportunities to get to the revelation, they're stuck, they'll never advance. So you hide around a few different things that they just need to find 1 and then they get to the revelation. Instead, what I had initially done was included multiple clues, but they didn't all converge on the same revelation, they just gave random bits of information. For example, in my first group, one of my students found loads of books about witchcraft and astrology, and that was interesting, but it didn't really help them get anywhere. And another student correctly identified the source of the explosion, a broken gas pipe. Great, but they still haven't found the thing that they need to find. And unfortunately, they never actually found the main clue, which is a metal box that has been broken open and something taken from inside. They failed that 1 roll to spot it, and they had no other route to finding that information. So in the end, I had to use the force clue, which is the bookshop owner, Mr. Abernathy, arriving and discovering that something has been taken from his shop. That's where the force clue was really helpful, and it's really good to have that. But my students were a bit confused and frustrated because everything they tried to do didn't really matter. They only got the revelation when it was given to them on a plate. They didn't actually do anything to get it, and that took away some of their agency. So when it came round to doing it with the second group, I directed more of the clues towards the revelation, and they actually found it. They managed to dig around and find the metal box. So when Mr. Abernathy turned up, they had something to tell him, and they were already very engaged in that story. They were the ones acting, not Mr. Abernathy. So now I've updated the mystery to have those clues all pointing towards the final revelation. Yes, there are a few clues that still go in different directions, but there are 3 things that point them towards the metal box. And you can find out the details of all of that in the previous video where I go over the setting of the world and the Bookshop Blast mystery. Now this scene was where players started to roll dice for the first time. And this worked pretty well. It was really easy for them to understand the system, although there were quite a few failures, and the failures led to frustration. They wanted to keep rolling again because they weren't happy with the results they got, but they pretty soon worked out that the help action, giving someone else an extra die, is really useful, and they could trade them around and make sure everybody had the best opportunities. And they started picking up some inspiration points, which was really good too. So the next revelation was learning the identity of the culprit who had stolen the flask from the bookshop and who had blown it up. And that is Mad Maggie. Again, in this case, my first group rolled pretty badly. They went around and tried to talk to some bystanders, but with a combination of some strange questioning and some terrible rolls, they didn't get any information out of that. but this time I had built in multiple clues to get to the information. So they went a different route and got hold of the security camera footage, and they saw Mad Maggie going into the shop and then coming out moments later, and then it exploded. So they knew it was her. The other group got a little bit lost here. They didn't know quite what to do. Perhaps I didn't present the options clearly enough. So I had to use a force clue with Mad Maggie coming out of a nearby shop, and they recognised her long grey hair from one that they found inside the bookshop. Then they went on a bit of a weird sidetrack when they went to visit one of Mad Maggie's old friends that they thought might be in the prison. So they went over there and chatted to them for a bit, and I gave them a little bit of extra information just so it wasn't a complete waste of time. But I can't exactly remember why they went in that direction. There was logic at the time, but I had to improvise pretty quickly. Perhaps if they had found Mad Maggie earlier, they wouldn't have got sidetracked, but it was alright, we got it back on course pretty quickly. By now, they had all got to grips with how the roles worked, and they were assigning different players to different activities because they had better skills, so they were really working as a team quite well there. And while they had picked up inspiration points, they weren't using them quite yet, they were still holding them. The next stage was to get to Mad Maggie's house. Before doing this with the second group, I had the idea to get them to come up with a rumour about Mad Maggie. All of the players would have known Mad Maggie as a character in the town, someone who's strange and unusual, and there's plenty of mystery and rumours around her. So I got them each to invent one. A crazy old lady who might be a witch? Yes, there were some creative and quite dark rumours there about what Mad Maggie did to other children when she was at school and that kind of thing. And this was another good case of getting the students involved in building the world and getting more immersed. And they used a lot of English in the process. So going to Mad Maggie's house was a lot of fun. Jumping over the fence, sneaking in past the goats, trying not to disturb them, and then getting into the house itself, either by the back door or breaking in the front door. And then getting themselves down into the basement where they'd find the clues for the next revelation, which was Mad Maggie is going to destroy the vial. There were a lot of rolls, and inspiration points started being spent for the first time. The first group were very liberal with spending them. They kind of got the idea that they'd get them back pretty quickly, and they were happy to inspire each other for getting over the fence and sneaking and that kind of thing. And this brought up a ruling that I hadn't thought about before, which applies to the situation where students are all rolling for the same thing at the same time. And that is, if one player fails, they get an inspiration point from another player. Alright? So the player who originally failed gets to roll again. Now that player rolls a 6, and they immediately get an inspiration point for that 6. Now, the situation was, can they then spend that inspiration point in that exact moment to help another player who has failed? So you have like this chain of inspiration points, and as they kept rolling 6s, they kept getting more inspiration points. And this happened in a couple of situations, and to be honest, I didn't really know what to do. So in the end, I decided that, yes, it's okay, you can do that, but there has to be some narrative justification. If one player inspires another, they have to explain how, that's part of the rules anyway, and then if that player who has just been inspired wants to inspire another character, then they have to justify how they do that, and it has to be slightly different. Ultimately, this is what you want to get out of the game, them speaking and them being creative with their language. It doesn't really matter about the rules and the balance and whether they succeed or not. Now, in contrast to the first group, the second group were very reluctant to spend their inspiration points. I think part of the reason for this is they hadn't realised that they'd get them back really quickly, and I hadn't shown them the progression chart yet. The progression chart is something I haven't told you guys about yet, and it's something I'll cover in the next video. Basically, every time they spend an inspiration point, it contributes to this progression chart, and that unlocks a bunch of team perks. So perhaps if they'd had that visual chart in front of them, they could see how spending their inspiration points would be positive. They don't need to hang on to them. Anyway, they all got into the house and into the basement and figured out what was going on from the alchemical laboratory setup and the diaries. And then Mad Maggie turned up. And here things went a bit off-piste, in a good way. That's what makes this game so special. It's unpredictable. You never really know what your students are going to do, and they have the freedom to be very creative. So my first group split up. 2 of them went downstairs to do the investigating, and 2 of them stayed up to keep a look. They were very paranoid that Mad Maggie might return, and when she did, they immediately spotted her, warned the others, and they all got out of there. So with a few good rolls, they managed to flee and they were on their way out. But I didn't want it to end there. I didn't want it to be such an undramatic climax. So instead, I had Mad Maggie get back in her red Mini and chase them through the countryside, which led to a very action-packed and tense scene as they were trying to get away. Some of them managed to hide, some of them jumped over a bunch of rocks, and eventually they lost her. Okay, so that was a bit unusual, but then they did something even more unexpected, which was instead of going back and giving Mr. Abernathy the vial, they kept it for themselves. They didn't trust him. They got some information about him, but they lied to him. They said they hadn't found it yet. Not exactly how I'd anticipated things going, but that's completely fine. There is no set script. It's not a predetermined story. Although I had anticipated that they might side either with Mad Maggie or with Mr. Abernathy, the reality is they sided with neither and stayed in the middle. And that's fine. They can have more mysteries after that, and in fact we transitioned to the next thing with no issue. The second group had a different encounter with Mad Maggie. One of them escaped with the vial, but the others stayed in the house and they had a confrontation with her that went back and forth. It was like a standoff, nobody was willing to budge. As the players arguing with Mad Maggie didn't have the vial, they couldn't give it back. They had nothing to work with, they just had to refuse her. And meanwhile, the student who had snuck off went home very quickly and transferred the contents of the vial into another vial and then replaced the original with some water and gelatin and some asthma inhaler gas. I don't know exactly how it worked, but they rolled a good operate roll and they created this concoction, which they brought back to the house and gave to Mad Maggie, who believed it. And then she went to destroy the vial, and the players went off and had the original vial, which they gave to Mr. Abernathy. So there we had two completely different ways of resolving the problem, and they all worked out fine. Yes, I had to improvise quite a lot, and this is required from the teacher. You will have to react to what your students do, which is a lot of the fun of the game. You want them to be creative and problem solving and using their language to explore different options. Quite a lot of the time they discuss what they're gonna do, like out of context, out of the game. They have a conversation. Should we do this? Should we do this? What's the benefits of doing this way? What's the negatives if we do that? So for the teacher, it's about creating a balance. You want to be fair and let them do the cool things that they want to do within some limits. You want to set some boundaries, otherwise things will go completely off the rails. And if you're not sure, like I was with the gelatin asthma inhaler concoction, make them roll for it, and if they roll well, then yes, it works. If they fail, then no, it doesn't. And in terms of the system as a whole, it worked really well. Players had no trouble understanding how many dice they had to roll, and they could immediately see whether they'd succeeded or not. In many respects, the rules just got out of the way and let the role play happen. And the dice rolls themselves, a lot of them were very dramatic. I had a lot of students blowing on their dice to give them luck because they were so tense about the outcome. They were so immersed in the story that they really wanted that roll to happen. The only slight confusion I had with both groups is about how help and inspiration work. In terms of the mechanics, they understood it perfectly. They knew that they could just give someone an extra die and they could only give one. And inspiration the same, they just re-roll. But in a narrative and roleplay side of things, it was a little bit more difficult to get them to explain how they're helping, how they're inspiring their partner. I think that's something they'll get better at as they play the game more, but sometimes it is worth just pausing the game and getting them to think about that. They're not used to describing those things yet, and you need to prompt them to do so. All in all, the first mystery was a great success for the groups that I finished it with. It was fantastic to see them developing their fluency and really enjoying speaking English. In the next video in the series, I'll be talking about that progression system that I mentioned earlier in relation to inspiration points. The whole idea is to get players working together, and the perks that they can get benefit the team. And when that video is ready, it'll be right here for you to click on. But for now, I've been Will from Enchanted ESL, wishing you all the joy and success in your teaching. See ya!